I am
Yes.
thrilled to be joined on Bad Faith Podcast today by Natasha Lennard. Now, Natasha is a columnist for The Intercept. She's also written for The Nation, Book Forum, and The New York Times, among others. She's also the associate director of the Creating Publishing and Critical Journalism graduate program at the New School for Social Research in New York, and the author of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life. Welcome to the pod, Natasha.
Hey, thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
Well, look, the reason I reached out is because you wrote this great piece last month called Pro-Israel Advocates Are Weaponizing Safety on College Campuses. And you get into the question of safetyism, whether or not the left kind of jumped the shark by opening the door to this kind of safetyist critique, whether or not there's a substantive difference between kind of what has been described as safetyism by the right when they make criticisms of snowflake leftists versus the way that pro-Israel students on these elite college campuses and beyond have been weaponizing the idea of safetyism to basically suppress pro-Palestinian speech on campus. And I'd like to work through a lot of that with you. But first, lay out for me what is going on university campuses, particularly Columbia's campus seems to be a hotbed for this sort of thing.
Yes, we are seeing this across the nation, but certainly places like Columbia and its sister school, Barnard, but we've also seen it at Harvard and notably Stanford. At least these are, elite institutions that have caught headlines in the establishment press for various types of tensions and campus politics playing out since October 7th, since the start of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. And what we are seeing again and again, and what is certainly being given far too much incredulous space within mainstream media platforms and outlets, is the idea that Jewish students who are Zionists are somehow under a very legitimate threat when faced with protest movements, speeches, and activism on campus against Israel's war, against Israel's policy, and even against Israel as an ethno-state. And the claim by a number of these Zionist student groups and Zionist organizations, political organizations that have glommed onto these campus arguments, debates, and politics per se, has been that it is, and it's, we've heard this in all kinds of political terrains for years, but all the more so since October 7th, that it is anti-Semitic to be active and to be advocating for Palestinian rights and against Israeli aggression, occupation, apartheid, and genocide on campus. And so you've seen this discourse weaponized to quite an extraordinary degree, with students claiming that they are being harassed, being placed under threat, are in physical danger by virtue of seeing things like a Palestinian flag emoji on a student's Zoom profile, or, the presence of Palestinian students speaking publicly about having family members killed in the onslaught on Gaza. So, you've seen this argument of safetyism, and the feeling of safety being weaponized to quite an extraordinary degree. And unlike the, now well-established right-wing claims about left-wing snowflake safetyism and feelings above practical threat and oppressive systems, it being largely conservative, right-wing, or, centrist Zionist students who are relying on this rhetoric to both silence Palestinian voices and to advocate for investigations on campus of faculty and other, speakers who come to campus wanting to advocate for Palestinian life, basically.
Good summary there. So lest anybody have a concern that we are bulldozing over legitimate claims of anti-Semitism, we should address that as well, as you do in the article, which is to say, of course, anti-Semitism is real, and there is reason to be concerned about some accounts of rising anti-Semitic actions. But when you go through the kinds of complaints that are being raised, you already mentioned the Palestinian flag emoji being cited as an instance of discomfort that came from one professor, actually, who asked a student to take that down. Can you tell us about some other instances to perhaps assuage concerns from a listener who might think, well, yeah, but what if some of this stuff is real?
Right. And, I should preface a lot of this by saying, I'm speaking as a professor myself, teaching at the New School, and as a Jewish person. And I don't want to be suggesting for a second that anti-Semitism is not a often deadly and very, very real problem and rising. Be it in the kind of general world and on campuses. We have seen instances of Jewish students being harassed and targeted solely for being visibly Jewish. So wearing a kippah or having, any sort of a Star of David necklace, perhaps, and being harassed for that reason. And that is, unequivocally racist, anti-Semitic violence and harassment. And there should be absolutely no space or time for that. That is what we have to stand in solidarity against, in as much as we must stand vigorously against any sort of anti-Palestinian violence, anti-Arab violence, the sort of thing we're also seeing extraordinarily fiercely rise around the country, around the world, and on campuses too. But as, and I hate to have to say that as a Jewish person and as a professor, but I think it is all the more important given the genuine risks and threats that people are facing and that we have to be reckoning with and vigorous against. We really need to be able to distinguish between feeling safe and being safe. And we need to be able to insist that a challenge to the Israeli state, both in terms of policy and in terms of, statehood claims, which are political questions, that this not be conflated with a threat to Jewish people as Jews. Of course, there is an extraordinarily long and ever more, doubled down upon by institutions like the Anti-Defamation League, conservative lobbying groups, on insisting that we uphold a conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that makes this discussion very, very difficult to have, lest further claims of anti-Semitism, be raised. But I think we have to stand together and be very, very clear that in our standing against anti-Semitism, what we are demanding is that there not be a dilution of how serious this is, such that every time someone protests for Palestinian life, it is taken seriously and it is not conflated as a threat to Jewish students. That in and of itself is a most extraordinary act of, violent anti-Palestinian rhetoric that undergirds so much of the politics of US complicity in this war. So I think the need to be able to call out anti-Semitism and fight it when we see it is in fact being destabilized by the claim of Zionist students feeling unsafe in the face of vocal anti-Israel activism and pro-Palestinian activism on campus. And yeah, there have been some really quite, absurd examples. You mentioned the incident that I start this column noting, which was a professor who was unnamed in this leak, from the social work school at Columbia, which is a graduate school, writing to a student and saying, please, can you remove your political flag emoji from your Zoom name? Because it is, and I quote, it has caused trauma reactions. And, and this almost, it does sound like the sort of parodized tropish version of woke culture that the right has been parodying and pillorying the left for bringing on campus for years. And it certainly doesn't help those of us who do want to take seriously the demand to have anti-fascist, anti-racist politics and practice with and amongst our students, when you have these really, really absurd examples of this kind of language being twisted, trivialized, overused, and weaponized in support of, claims that are illegitimate claims of unsafety, that are in themselves silent acts of silencing against Palestinian voices and freedom.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the irony here is that, of course, on one hand, you have students that say, I'm talking about the fact that my real life family members have been killed. And you're telling me that their real life deaths are giving you abstract trauma. You have Columbia students that have been the subject of a chemical attack with a substance that is suspected to be skunk, this chemical weapon that was developed by the IDF. And after that event, you write that some students had hoped there might be a policy shift on campus that took the actual physical safety of pro-Palestinian activists, pro-Palestinian students more seriously in light of the fact that now real physical danger had been entered into the conversation. They say that has not happened. And you, of course, have the 3 Palestinian Americans who were quite literally shot, one of whom remains paralyzed simply for wearing keffiyehs at the end of last year, relatively early in this conflict. And despite all of that, despite all of the real life identifiable instances of Palestinians who've been subjected to real harm on campus. And by the way, the 6-year-old who was stabbed to death and the mother who was stabbed and survived fairly shortly after October 7th, what was it, in Michigan?
Yes.
The public focus has been very much on, again, the safety, this kind of emotional safety of Jewish students on campus or any kind of pro-Zionist student on campus. So much so that, remember, last year there was this congressional hearing that House Republicans held in December where they allowed students to come up and give testimony as to their experiences. And this one bit of testimony really struck me because it was so specific and so serious that I thought to myself, and I tweeted about this, I said, if there's not an investigation and this doesn't turn up some real fruit immediately because of the gravity of the allegation, then it raises some pretty clear implications that it is in fact a lie. And the claim was, and we'll splice this in so listeners can hear it.
Well, I am both honored and thankful to be here. I should not be here today. I should be studying for my upcoming finals. I should be taking in every moment, every experience as an undergraduate student in my senior year of college. So while I should not be here today, I am. Because 36 hours ago, I, along with most of campus, sought refuge in our rooms, as classmates and professors chanted proudly for the genocide of Jews while igniting smoke bombs and defacing school property. The neighboring university's president immediately released a statement describing this as a brazen display of anti-Semitism. He went on saying, "Silence in the face of last night's demonstration of anti-Semitism and hate near our doorstep is not an option for me." Well, the doorstep of the neighboring university is in fact Penn. And in fact, Penn's president did choose silence. The neighboring university's president swiftly denounced the incident, and yet our president cannot. Because the glorious October 7th, and you're a dirty little Jew, you deserve to die, are words said not by Hamas, but by my classmates and professors.
But the student said, I am here because 36 hours ago, I, along with most of my campus, sought refuge in our, let me skip it. He says that a Penn professor, he's at the University of Pennsylvania, allegedly said, quote, "You're a dirty little Jew, you deserve to die." Now, can you imagine if a Penn professor really told a student, "You're a dirty little Jew and you deserve to die"? That's some of the ugliest language I've ever heard. I would expect you would be running to that student and say, "Oh my God, identified the professor, they should be fired." Right?
Of course. I mean, that would be, it's that kind of, it's not, I do not want to be, I've never made the claim that there's not such a thing as violence in speech. And were that said, that is grounds for immediate firing. That person should be nowhere in an educational space or indeed in public discourse. Absolutely. You forego any right to political speech if you're engaged in that kind of violent oppressive speech act. That does more than, simply, that's more than a threat. That's an act of rhetorical violence were it to have happened. And you would have assumed exactly that there would have been a vigorous follow-up. And I think part of the difficulty in parsing, especially for, people who are, saying just reading the Times, looking at CNN headlines every day. If you're just a kind of general news consumer, it would be very, very difficult for you to really parse what is or is not going on in educational spaces as regards this issue, as regards what really is threatening, who really is in danger, what kind of rhetoric are we seeing and hearing? Because you get these reports that say massive spike in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campuses. And then there's these lists sometimes of incidents. And you realize that when you pick them apart more specifically, you will have listed next to, yes, a chemical attack, chemical spray against a pro-Palestine rally on the Columbia campus, spray brought onto campus by veteran Israeli military members who are also themselves Columbia students. And these students who were sprayed having to go to hospital. And that's listed alongside students chanting with a Palestinian flag, chanting, the now so focused upon and overly the sight of completely baseless paranoia of Palestinians chanting from the river to the sea, which, Netanyahu has made quite clear is in fact Israeli policy now. And that is listed as a threat to Jewish students alongside Palestinian students and pro-Palestinian protesters being chemically attacked and having to go to hospital for that. So the way these things are collated together creates, I think, a really misleading sense of where threats really lie, which certainly doesn't help Jewish students and, those of us who want to look after each other really be able to locate where threats are and where harm is being done. You did mention very notably, not just these chemical attacks on the Columbia campus, but 3 students being shot and this shooting, which has left one young man paralyzed. It's listed alongside these sort of incidents as if there's any sort of, parity there, which is, obviously this horrible, isomorphic mapping of when threats to Israelis are listed alongside the threats to the Palestinian people. And that's historically never been parallel. So when you see this playing out in a similar frame on campus, I think we have to be really attentive to that. And it's also very much plays into the very agenda-driven work of groups like the ADL, who are very specifically obfuscatory in when they gather data and information about anti-Semitic acts in general and on campuses, because you don't actually know specifically when someone has perhaps been waving a Palestinian flag, been chanting from the river to the sea, or been more specifically and violently anti-Semitic. These things are purposefully collated together because it's explicitly part of the policy of groups like the ADL to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and to define anti-Semitism accordingly. That certainly doesn't help me keep my students and my fellow colleagues safe.
Part of what is so frustrating about it, and you alluded to this, is that the media has played a significant role in creating what seems like parity between the claims that are being made by groups. And in Congress, elected leaders have too. When Biden and the administration seemingly is pressured to say, well, yes, Islamophobia is bad as well. It's always Islamophobia is bad, and we're going to pair it with anti-Semitism. There's never an opportunity to speak directly to the, let's say, the shooting of those 3 Palestinian American students at Brown University. There was a follow-up with a press secretary where they were asked, did Biden reach out to the family members of those shot? And I don't know if there's been any follow-up since then, but at the time, the answer was, we have no information on that. You see an incredible asymmetry when it comes to the vigils by Congress members that have taken place for the people that were killed on October 7th, the Israelis that were killed, versus the 33,000 plus Palestinians that have been killed since then. You saw the targeting of Rashida Tlaib and the censorship campaign that happened. And all of this seems to be, along with the media, reinforcing an asymmetry of what is actually happening on the ground. And you alluded to, and I want to drill down on a little bit, this piece that was written in The Atlantic by a Stanford student at the end of last month named Theo Baker. And this Stanford student, I believe he was a sophomore, was given an opportunity to write in one of America's most historically esteemed papers, what used to be a liberatory anti-slavery paper. I don't know that we would consider The Atlantic to have quite that sheen on it these days. But he wrote a piece called The War at Stanford, subtitled, I Didn't Know That College Would Be a Factory of Unreason. You describe this as a supposedly a neutral narrative that treats the conflict on his college campus as a battle between imperiled Jewish students and unreasoned pro-Palestine zealots. And particularly this article went sort of viral because he named and described behavior of one Stanford student in particular, who said that Biden is complicit in the genocide, not only complicit, but responsible for it, saying, quote, "I'm not calling for a vigilante to do it, but I think that I'd be happy if Biden were dead." So I wanted you to weigh in on this piece and, generally speaking, what you make of the media climate around these campus issues.
Well, I think we've first of all, obviously it's worthy of note that who gets this kind of large platform and voice to speak as student at this moment. It's not someone who, has lost family in Gaza, who perhaps has had educational experiences in Gaza, because really, if we're talking about the war on campus, there's something kind of grim in that headline too. You want to talk about war on campus? There are no more campuses in Gaza. Every single university has been obliterated, razed to the ground by Israel's war. There are no standing institutions of higher education, and hundreds of educators and professors have been killed, thousands displaced, unable to work again. So if we're talking about a war on campus, to call anything a war on campus if you're not talking about that war on the obliteration of scholastic life and sites of knowledge production, I kind of am like, we've got our eyes in the wrong place. But we, should be able to talk about how that kind of discourse is created and given space and ground. It's probably noticeable that the author of that Atlantic piece, the Stanford student, is the son of New York Times writer Peter Baker. So, maybe had a few connections in there. But also the student has done some quite impressive student journalism in the past. I'm not saying he's without chops or whatever industry term we would use. But it was just this extremely imbalanced article that was under that kind of very classically formatted, I did speak to people from both sides, producing this notion of, projected parity and symmetry. But really, if you just kind of do any sort of slightly lower than first read analysis, you do have this, almost archetypal presentation of the reasoned student just asking for everyone to have a really understanding, shed light on the situation debate. When you've got students really crying out for the end of the war that's killing their families. And this call for reason, I find sort of cold-blooded and unreasonable in and of itself. I actually don't think this is a particularly I don't think this is a time for calm or a time for dispassionate debate. And the way in which, pro-Palestinian students and Arab and Palestinian students are presented, and faculty actually in that article, does make it sort of reiterates pretty standard and very unpleasant tropes of kind of the brute, the horde, the brown, unreasoned native, which is obviously I'm not particularly surprised to see the Atlantic putting that out. As you note, they're not exactly a particularly liberatory site of writing, and haven't been for a good number of years now. Yeah.
Yes.
But it's not, I would say that's pretty typical of the kind of coverage we're seeing of campus battles and the campus framework and ideas of safety and danger. And it's, one thing I also did want to qualify is that I'm not saying that Zionist students and faculty members who are speaking about feeling unsafe, I'm not saying they're lying. I don't think that's what's going on. I think there is a weaponization by certainly Republicans in order to go after, other anti-racist efforts and, certain DEI and, college frameworks of, often dealt with badly, often far too liberal and not very liberatory and anti-oppressive frameworks to deal with oppressive systems and habits on campus and practices on campus. I do think this is being weaponized by the GOP and falls into kind of the classic culture warrior dynamic. But at the same time, I do think that there are a lot of students who grew up, like so many of us in Jewish households did, grew up being told that, yes, you are identified with Israel, that you're intractably identified with Israel, and that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And it takes a lot of difficult unlearning that a lot of my comrades, in Jewish Voice for Peace and other activist groups speaking out boldly for Palestine have had to do, a sort of unlearning of a framework that insists to you that not only is Israel, a noble and necessary state, but it is necessary for your safety. So you've got those messages that are very, very hard to break. And you've got them being, doubled down on by the sort of statistics and reports that the ADL is putting out saying anti-Semitism is everywhere. You are under threat. And then you get it, treated as legitimate and certainly justified by university administrations, by, the White House. And so that creates this very, very powerful structure of feeling that's very, very hard to undo. And I believe that it creates a feeling of unsafety, but I do think it's the job of universities, it's the job of professors, it's those of us ethically committed to our students' well-being to demystify and to actually talk about how safety, feelings of safety, and oppressive speech acts, oppressive environments do get reiterated or get weaponized. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so this is the tough question, though. This is the meat and potatoes, because there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of moving parts. Okay.
Yes.
So at the beginning of all of this, not the beginning, but what really touched off the firestorm was this congressional hearing with 3 Ivy League deans. Columbia narrowly escaped going down over this one because I think she was on vacation and just didn't show up. But Harvard, Penn, and MIT show up. Claudine Gay, in particular, the former president of Harvard, very clumsily answers, I think, a series of questions about whether or not a certain kind of action would constitute a threat against life. I can see why she pivoted and dodged and didn't answer clearly, because the kind of threat that was described has no relationship to anything that was ever happening on campus. So she didn't want to validate the premise, but she did a clumsy job at avoiding doing so. Maybe if she were a law school professor, she would have handled the situation a little bit better. But her background's in economics, and she did not acquit herself verbally the best. Okay. So that opens up the door to this campaign by one noted billionaire, Bill Ackman, to get rid of her. And after trying and failing a couple times, he finally succeeds. But that wasn't the end of his pogrom, if you will, against the leaders of these higher education institutions, who he thinks are not being sufficiently tough on the pro-Palestinian students at those institutions. Despite obviously complaints from pro-Palestinian students that they are actually being treated unfairly, even under the status quo of people like Claudine Gay. I cannot stop doing that. Roxane Gay is a journalist who happens to be Claudine Gay's cousin, I think.
Oh, I didn't know they were related. Oh, funny.
They're actually related, which is like short-circuiting my brain, and I cannot stop doing that. Sorry. But cut to Bill Ackman, who was a good liberal up until this point, right? Starts going after DEI programs in particular, saying that this is part of the problem, saying that these programs are not including Jewish identity sufficiently and protecting Jewish students, kind of bandwagoning what has up until this point been a right-coded agenda item. At the same time that some people on the right are saying, hey, you love this DEI stuff. You're a liberal. You can't be upset about it now. I am sympathetic to your concerns here because I also hate libs on college campuses, but you can't turn your back on them. You enabled all of this to be happening. And at the same time of all of that, he and others start weaponizing this idea of safetyism, which is this kind of DEI's kind of adjacent idea of really privileging people's subjective kind of emotional experiences on campus in the service of Jewish students on campus. So there's this really messy morass where people are appropriating different kinds of arguments for different kind of ends. But what it feels like to me is that it's maybe a come to Jesus moment for some parts of the left who maybe similarly overstated the case with respect to some instances of campus safety. But do we want to concede that point? Do we want to concede that point in a limited way? Are we concerned that there will be a free-for-all of an indifference to the kind of subjective feelings of students' experiences on campus if we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if we want to maintain some investment in the idea that students' experiences on campus is notable and worthwhile and should be considered, how do you start to draw the lines so that what you describe at the end of your article as a both sides world, where a student who has the police called on them by another white student, a Black student who has the police called on them, isn't treated the same, their concerns aren't treated the same as the white student who had felt unsafe because of the Black student's mere presence, i.e. racism? How do we avoid a world where those kind of false equivalences aren't ultimately made?
I mean, which has always been true long before the current issues around the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and, you know, the existence of Palestinians being treated as a threat and a grounds for feeling unsafe. Before this became the kind of front line and like focal point of campus racism debates, there, you know, the idea of what was being called, you know, snowflake culture and what culture warriors were the anti-woke culture warriors were railing against, it's not like we didn't have answers to that, which would be, yes, there is a kind of liberal and, you know, unthinking, almost depoliticized in terms of real active anti-fascism and anti-racism, anti-racist work. There is a kind of liberal depoliticized version that we have seen playing out on campuses, which is really just about feelings, as opposed to, are we permitting certain speech, certain activity on our campuses, in our midst, in our spaces that, you know, where we do have more choices than just what does or does not align with the First Amendment? Are we reproducing systems of hierarchy, oppression, and white supremacist violence? So, you know, we were able before this current onslaught on Gaza, when we were talking about anti-racist work on campus, to say, no, it's not valid if a white student who was, you know, brought up in a racist community and household feels unsafe in the presence of a Black person. We don't validate that feeling if they're acting on that and standing their ground and either harming a Black student or calling the cops on a Black student. Obviously, as a professor, it's your job to challenge that framework of racism wherein they hold that as the presence of Black students to be a grounds for safety. You challenge that. That's anti-racist work. And we were doing that and insisting on that long before the question and this framework of campus safety turned more specifically to issues of Jewish students and Zionist students. So I think the same applies. How were we able to draw the distinction between legitimizing certain frameworks of campus safety being invalid and not worth reifying, and certain ones being, you know, worth really listening to, saying, you know, actually, no, I'm not going to have an anti-trans speaker come and speak to my kids at the new school. Absolutely not. You know, some things are not up for debate. And how are we able to make that distinction? You make that distinction by actually looking at material histories of oppression and how they get reiterated in our midst or not. And it is simply not materially grounded. And something that I think stands up to any sort of critical analysis or argument to say that challenging the Israeli state is in turn a threat to Jewish students. That is not materially grounded. What is materially grounded is that Black students have been faced with extraordinarily systematic physical and institutional violences that the majority of white students haven't had. So we're not just talking about privileging some feelings over others. We're talking about whether we create educational environments and spaces that reproduce the violences of, you know, the world that students are entering into.
So I am sympathetic to the idea that kind of a historical power dynamic should inform the decisions that are made about whether or not there are, let's say, legitimate feelings of being unsafe. In the same way that it would be, you could understand that in a society where those power imbalances persist, it is less likely that a student who belongs to a historically protected group, a group that gets the benefit of protection from the law and other kinds of institutions, is likely to actually experience violence, real violence, as opposed to other kinds of groups. If one kind of student has the power to wield a police presence that is likely to result in a interaction with a Black student based on precedent that could be legitimately physically harmful to that student, then the power dynamics there are pretty clear. But I have to push back because we live in a real life scenario where we have leaked recordings from Students for Justice in Palestine, for example, at Columbia University, that show administrators talking about how to address these situations in ways that seem to indicate that they genuinely believe, who was it? The Columbia VP, Gerald Roseberg, was captured on some of this audio, and we can insert some of this into the episode as well.
I think when these protests go on, there is a lot of the rhetoric in the protests that is extremely, extremely upsetting to many of our students.
But what are examples of that?
So I think all the talk about genocide, all the talk about apartheid state and racist state, Minouche, Shafiq, you're supporting genocide. I think if you're saying that, you don't think, why would anybody be upset about that? But I think I could imagine that somebody listening to that an Israeli student being told that their state is an apartheid state, a racist state committing genocide, seems to them like an incitement of violence against them.
Seeming very unsympathetic to the interests of Palestinian students, and basically characterizing the pro-Palestinian protests as being dangerous because they use words like genocide and apartheid, and that those words themselves are a kind of violence. So you and I can sit here and say, well, subjectively, historically, obviously, the state that is being accused of the genocide and has been described as plausibly committing the genocide by the ICJ is the one that's in power. And it's not oppressive for students to put up pro-Palestine flags on their doors, even if Jewish students might be made to feel uncomfortable. But I do wonder if that's an argument that's going to be especially persuasive when there are people who do seem to legitimately hold the view, or not legitimately, but sincerely hold the view that because the October 7th attack was an attack on Israel by Hamas or whatever other reason, really do perceive themselves, whether it's the long legacy of Jewish persecution and the legacy of the Holocaust, all of these are reasons that are frequently levied as to why that kind of oppressor-oppressee dynamic in many folks' eyes, many pro-Zionist eyes and others, is not especially persuasive. What would you say to that?
I mean, a couple of things, because I think it is complicated. And also, I've brought up, and as did a professor at Columbia, classics professor, who's also been talking about these sort of dynamics and how to navigate them on campus, a gentleman called Joe Howley, also brought up the kind of comparison of what do you do with a racist white student who says he feels unsafe in the presence of a young Black man? You don't give that legitimacy. And, obviously these things don't map entirely because anti-white racism is not real. Anti-Semitism is real. But obviously we are not talking here about a, across the board systematic, effort to see anti-Semitic actions perpetrate on campuses. That's not what the pro-Palestine movement is. What it is a movement for Palestinian life and freedom. And that does mean standing against Israel and Israel's war and Israel's apartheid regime and Israel's occupations. So, I think this makes it a quite specific case, but, it's either we commit ourselves to a politics that refuses to allow this ever more fascistic state, this ethno-state, to act in our name, in the alleged name of my safety. And, that's why the chant "not in our name" is so powerful amongst Palestinian solidarity, Jewish activists. Either we permit that or we don't. And, it's whether it's persuasive to an administration or a system of government or a framework wherein challenging Israel is one of the more difficult things to do per se. I don't know if we're going to be particularly persuasive, but it remains nonetheless crucial work to insist that no, Israel does not stand for Jewish people. No, challenging Israel is not anti-Semitic. And more crucially, Palestinian existence is not a threat to Jewish safety, because an insistence on that is grounds for the sort of ethnic cleansing and genocidal acts that we are seeing. That is the kind of undergirding logic of it. And we can't allow that to persist in our midst at all. And that's not just a question of feeling. That is, you are seeing these sort of deeply racialized logics play out and cause real harm, enable the complicity with genocide on one hand, and cause real harm on campus of which students are allowed to speak, who is considered per se a threat from their sheer existence and presence, and whether we as faculty members, members of the press, members of the media, people who are able to give certain voices platforms or not, whether we permit those sort of asymmetries and those sort of power imbalances and those sort of both rhetorical and, physical violences to be reiterated in our midst. And I say, we don't. We can't always make these perfect analogies. It is certainly not perfectly analogous to talk about the white student feeling illegitimately unsafe, but nonetheless feeling that, because it's not, I can't, I don't want to begin to even remotely suggest that anti-Semitism isn't deadly real and on the rise.
Yeah.
But, we can't, at the center of any of this discussion has to be, we are not talking about a mass movement against Jewish students. We are talking about a mass movement against an ethno-state that is perpetuating a genocide in our name.
Yes. And there are so many, obviously, Jewish activists on the pro-Palestinian side, as you've alluded to, with Not in Our Name and Jewish Voices for Peace and all of these groups. But here's where I get caught up, and the reason why sometimes a kind of free speech absolutism, frankly, appeals to me. Partly it's because, especially in the context of Israel-Palestine, over the years we've seen so much censorship justified against Palestinians because of these Orientalist claims of them being particularly violent, terroristic. We've seen all of the rhetoric around rape and barbarism following October 7th. And that has justified some of the strictest limitations on speech and freedom to associate, whether it's anti-BDS laws and the like, in the United States of America. And when you see how easily that kind of, frankly, a kind of safetyism or national security, whatever you want to call it, approach has validated those kinds of moves, it makes me skeptical of any bars on speech, however one might justify them. I'm afraid they'll be inflicted back on us. So you write, one example I was thinking of while you're talking was there could be someone who objected to, let's say, a Black Panther for being invited to come on campus, maybe one that really does have a criminal record, and saying this is someone who was a gun-toting, president-threatening, Antifa, individual who's now being invited by a Black student group or a criminal justice reform group or whatever it is. I do feel unsafe. What is the response to that? You bring up an example at the very end of your piece where the Hillel student group at the new school where you teach invited a lieutenant from the Israeli army to come and speak on campus this year. You objected to this, but you made a distinction between the reason you objected and one of the reasons that were offered by the students who were objecting to them coming on. And you said that you personally didn't want to glom on to the argument that you would feel utterly unsafe to have an active duty Israeli soldier on campus. You said you thought this was a true but weak argument. The students might feel unsafe, but they would not be unsafe. And I think that's right. But you go on to say, your case rather is that because it's a school that's founded on these kind of anti-war liberatory principles, that it is inconsistent to invite this person to campus, which I think is a much stronger argument. That being said, going back to the, let's say, a Black Panther example, or you could think of any number of other examples where students might be able to make a similar sort of claim. How do you guarantee that in opposing this IDF or former IDF or current IDF member coming on campus, that you're not basically setting more conservative students up to say, we're going to block X, Y, and Z people?
I think it's a really, really good point. And I think on the whole rests on a certain premise that, and also I've just never been a free speech absolutist. But I think that doesn't mean what I want to hold stable is that I trust certain institutional power structures, for example, a university administration, to set up sort of stark rules as rails, delineating in advance of all cases what counts as, an acceptable sort of speaker, acceptable speech or not. I actually don't think I don't think political language, I don't think struggle works that way. I don't think we can set up some sort of set of rules in advance of what is or is not permissible speech in our midst. And obviously we are again talking about institutions that are not the government, right? So we are not beholden to mapping directly onto the freedoms of the First Amendment. We can make more, we can make stricter choices, as can, an online platform, as can X, as can Instagram. Do I love that, those sort of choices are in the hands of an Elon Musk? No. Do I love that they're in the hands of a usually conservative university administration? Of course I do not. That is a problem of power, and that is a problem of who gets to make these kind of decisions over speech. And so with that in mind, yes, I have sympathy and a lot of agreement with the argument of this will inevitably come and hurt the left more. It's not even a very slippery slope. It's almost just like a water slide that immediately will harm, anti-fascist groups. It will harm anti-racist speakers. It will harm, liberation activism on campus more than it will remove white supremacist groupings and organizations and speech, for example, from our midst. So yes, I am, attentive to the risks of inviting any sort of constraints on those sort of speeches. But I think that my response still, as it was before, when I've written about the free speech issues in the past, this hasn't, there's a temptation to be like, oh, crap, gotta hand it to the right. They really got us this time, hoisted by our own petard. But actually, I do remain, I kind of hold to my original arguments, which have been, actually, it does have to be consistent collective work to attend to what kind of environments we are creating and recreating and reinscribing. And it's not to save our students or save each other from hearing racist things or hearing, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian things. We've heard these things ad nauseum. No one's going to have these things introduced for the first time. It's do we create a space wherein they are reinscribed as legitimate in certain areas? And I think there is not an absolute argument you can ever give in advance. I do genuinely think it is complicated, difficult, will remain contested, and will be imperfect. But I think that is the work of considering how political spaces are made and how political speech and the fulcrums on which it rests and what gets considered a fulcrum at all. Who the sides in a debate are kind of invited to be. That is that work. And sometimes I think it is a legitimate conclusion to come to for example, in the case of like a Milo Yiannopoulos, to say, not just because, hearing extraordinarily violent anti-immigrant rhetoric is going to make a student emotionally incapable of functioning. I do think we need a little bit more resilience than that in our movements. I'm not trying to make everyone feel safe and comfy all the time. That would also be an act of mystification, and we should be demystifying. But at the same time, I don't want to pretend that all views are legitimate and that we shouldn't have acts of protest against certain ones being treated as, views that deserve more of our attention. And the idea of, then you don't hear all sides and you're in a bubble and you're closing yourself off. Come on, nonsense. We're completely surrounded by, undergirding a kind of accepted, given common sense of Zionist logics, white supremacist logics, bordered logics. But I think it's, So I just think it's an ongoing debate that is, and one that is,
I like that. I do sometimes think that we've witnessed this, right? We're watching Elon Musk, who managed to secure for himself a reputation as a free speech absolute or a free speech warrior, with, I would argue, the complicity of some people on the left who kind of will champion one moment of free speech consistency and then selectively ignore or not comment on other instances in which he's been deeply anti-speech. He, of course, is today traveling to go and meet with Modi, who he has bent the knee to and agreed to censor his opponents, Indian opponents, critics rather, not just in India, but all over the world, which is extending beyond the kind of censorship that these kind of tech companies typically give into to operate in various places around the world. And when he a month or two ago took that famous trip to meet with Netanyahu in Israel and came back and immediately said he is going to ban people who use the phrase from the river to the sea, right? And we all know he banned the Elon Jets account and all of those kinds of things. So I sometimes look at that and say the idea of someone being labeled as pro-free speech can be very dangerous because it causes people to ignore that everybody is basically operating on the basis of their ideological priors and only selectively picking up the free speech sword and shield when they feel like they're virtuous in doing so. Look at what's going on with Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens and the Daily Wire. It's a shambles. And Ben Shapiro is being subjected now to supercuts, which show him explaining all the reasons why people that have been fired for ideological reasons from institutions should not be fired, even though they are in ideological breach with those institutions, because the institution should uphold these free speech principles. Now that it's his own organization, it's, oh, well, we're a pro-Zionist organization, so it makes sense that we would part ways with Candace Owens, right? It's sloppy. It's all over the place. It's ridiculous. That being said, I like your rationale. I'm intrigued by the rationale that the institution here, your university in particular, ideologically was founded against the principles of a army committing a genocide, shall we say, and that it should not provide honorarium to, it should not directly fund a speaker who is so opposed ideologically to what the university stands for. I think that's a principled reason to object to a speaker. However, if it is the case that the Hillel students have invited this person and the Hillel students are paying the bill, not the university itself, well, then we start to get into a thornier area. And especially with the instances like this, I do sometimes wonder, does the presence of this guy, or woman, I actually don't know, but does the fact that this person was allowed to speak actually help, frankly, the cause of pro-Palestinian activists? Because in so many instances, Israeli spokesmembers, et cetera, opening their mouths on English-speaking television has helped to turn public opinion against their military goals in Gaza. I mean, are you concerned about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not particularly concerned about it when you're talking about a space like the New School that does continue to justify its existence and its kind of raison d'etre being a kind of school of social justice and, fighting against historic harms being projected into the future. Look, did I expect that when a group of faculty wrote to the administration and said, we oppose an active lieutenant, an active officer in this army that has obliterated every single university institution, again, in Gaza in recent months, coming in and taking space in our university. Did I expect the administration to then cancel the event or ask that Hillel host it elsewhere, which they well could have? No, of course I didn't expect that. So it's more an act of protest. It's more an act of dissent to make the public letter and say we stand against where this person stands. And often I do also agree that the kind of more powerful dissenting position when there are speakers on campus that one feels are, bringing oppressive speech and oppressive positions to in your midst. I think, active protest is often, and disruption is often a far better move than kind of preemptive banning. Because I think, you can clarify what exactly you're standing against.
Right.
And I do often, and then when that happens, and that is in turn called silencing, I find that, somewhat ridiculous. The idea
and that's
that
Jonathan Chait just wrote this
I know,
article, right?
I was about to say,
sorry, go ahead.
Yes, the idea, no, I just mean, I agree. It's so funny, darkly funny. It's like, are you trying to tell me the Democrats, the president of the United States is being silenced? He does not have enough of a platform because of, an active movement against a war he and his administration are, funding with, to their own potential demise, continue to fund. I mean, this is what a abhorrent and evacuated of meaning understanding of what a politics in the public should or could be. I think it speaks a lot to the mainstream of the Democrats, that could even be a kind of legible argument that someone actually wrote out, but we know, Jonathan Chait. Well, I wasn't surprised it was him. He's done it again. But no, I think these questions of speech are complicated. And what I've also said in the past that I also do stand by is that, I'm aware that these things can come back and harm us in the same way, I've called very much against the increase in the harshness, severity, or number of anti-terror laws, because they are historically and consistently, even when developed to take on something like January 6 style protesters, so very immediately used with far more vigor by, unsurprisingly, any sort of law enforcement against, anti-fascist groups, Black liberation groups, pro-Palestinian groups, with such readiness that, obviously expanding that sort of state apparatus is not what I want to do. When it comes to interventions in speech, my policy doesn't tend to be, we need to ask that that systems of power as they currently exist have a kind of perfect code of where oppressive speech does and doesn't lie. I mean, that would be so extremely hypocritical of me to say I would like to endow a Musk or a, president of Penn with more power than they have. But that doesn't, but I think my claim is quite a different one, which is we as a non-astroturfed movement, unlike certain, pro-Zionist advocacy, but a kind of grassroots movement, I think should not be nervous about shutting down certain speech. But often that looks much more like the sort of protests we're seeing and the disruptions we're seeing and the discomfort being caused in sort of halls of power than asking politely for some speech to be banned in advance. Because also that's a sort of fruitless it's fruitless. It's not going to happen. So what do we have on our side? Numbers and the ability to disrupt and make kind of counter narratives and insist that they be heard. And I think you're seeing extraordinary acts of bravery when it comes to that around the country. But, this question of speech and, rule establishment and principle is that I don't actually want there's a TV show that I grew up watching called Peep Show. It's like Mitchell and Webb. It's an English comedy show. And there was this very, very funny scene where one of the characters was doing the kind of parodying the liberal framework or the kind of more absolute, almost libertarian, what I want is a world where, it's Jewish people and Arabs and Nazis all just walking around saying exactly what they want. And it's no, I actually want the Nazis to lose. I want, genocide apologists and, Zionist groups that insist they stand for all of us Jewish people. I want them to lose. I want to win. I want Palestinian liberation to win. I want Black liberation to win. I don't want a fair debate, right? Do we need a fair debate in order for certain persuasive movement building? Potentially. But my investment is not that we have some sort of perfect terrain of speech. It is actually to destroy harmful forces. And so I think that's why, my focus will always be on trying to figure out collectively how that is done, rather than saying, ooh, okay, have we got absolute kind of symmetry in speech capacities here? Are we being fair? Do we have a good space of debate? I don't actually always think that, shedding light on something is the best, what's it called? Disinfectant or, and I don't think that's proven true. I think we've seen the kind of violences of, Israeli speech, for example, play out again and again. It's hardly a secret, as you say. Do we need to invite it again? Do we need to keep taking it so legitimately as opposed to just opposing it and insisting against, a civility around that? Potentially, but
Yeah,
I do think it's complicated, right? And it's a complicated question on the left, whether, it's not, I just think I have certain arguments that I still believe about where and how certain speech is worth contesting and not just kind of hearing out once it's already,
tough because it's easier. I mean, the peep show logic or joke works, I think, much better with something where there is clarity, at least for now, like something like Nazis, right? As I say, for now, because there's some weird thing happening where Nick Fuentes apparently is now saying anti-Zionist stuff that's being picked up by Arab news outlets that maybe don't know that he's fully an anti-Semite and like piggybacking off this issue to just be more I don't like, it's very troubling times on the internet right now. But, does the joke still land if it's a issue that is in more disputed territory? And I am like, I think we all know the issue that has been so polarizing and that the right has gotten a lot of traction out of, but precisely because public opinion isn't as evolved as I think the opinion on these things in more liberal collegiate circles. And that is about, trans women in sports and those kinds of things where you're gonna find real differences of opinion among people who I wouldn't classify as out and out transphobes or bigots, right? So, yeah, are we going to say we're not going to allow, let's say, I forget which Scandinavian country, but there's some country where the scientists have come out with different advice as to what they recommend for a transition schedule for children that's different from what they have in America that is more conservative. Would one of those professors not be allowed to speak, or one of the scientists doctors be allowed to speak at an American university because that's perceived to be harmful to the interest of trans students on campus? Does it make them feel unsafe? Is that amplifying a genuinely transphobic movement in America in a way that is detrimental to those students? Or is it simply a neutral sort of difference of opinion in the medical field that's being arbitrated by people who have a lot more insight and knowledge than me sitting here just Googling stuff? What do you make of that?
No, I'm glad we're bringing in this other kind of terrain where questions of who gets to speak without disruption, who gets a platform. Obviously, yes, trans healthcare, trans children is like another key site of this. And you definitely, it's interesting, like again, we have to look at kind of how these sort of invitations and sites of debate come about in the first place. Like, what are the conditions of possibility? Which groups are inviting a conservative scientist that stands against, most global law? The idea that trans healthcare for children is new, completely debunked, absolutely untrue. So, what kind of space is invested in bringing in, the conservative outlier from a Scandinavian country? Interesting. Do we want to be entertaining those groups as legitimate political sources? Like, sure, I'm not going to stop, Mums for Liberty person having her own, house party with her chosen, Swedish scientist. If it's Sweden, I don't know which country it is.
I don't remember. I can Google that real quickly.
But I think, the trans so-called debate is a really, really interesting example because it is presented as if it were some sort of like organic, discomfort specifically among parents about like children as, this invariably cis child in some sort of peril for transness, which also we have to remember what kind of logic that's upholding. It's saying, that transness is bad. Or like, what if there were too many trans people? And I'm like, I'm not sure I like that. And then there's another discussion of safety that comes in here that sounds, when they're like, well, no, I support trans rights, but I do worry about the children. What about the children? That's what they used to say about gay people adopting. That's what they used to say about interracial marriages. The logics are the same. No, we support it, but what about the children? What if we embraced trans children? Which I think is a point that the historian Jules Gill-Peterson, author of The History of the Trans Child, has made again and again. It's like, what would it actually look like to embrace trans children as opposed to treating them in a kind of pre-pathologized form of medicalization as a site of risk and presuming that children are necessarily cis and therefore at risk of transness? But then to kind of, to get back more specifically to your point, the idea that, we are shutting down some sort of organic set of concerns that have raised and are the reason that there are hundreds and hundreds of anti-trans bills in state houses across the country. It's not true. Like, these are model bills written by groups like the Heritage Foundation and handed down to state houses to, when there is a profound lack of appealing politics, to base bait and to create paranoid sites of concern around, that most perfect object, the imagined child. How convenient. What a manipulatable figuration for a political imaginary. Quite a fascist, pro-natalist political imaginary. You poll most people and they're actually unconcerned about trans people, unconcerned about use of bathrooms.
I think that
was
all true. All the stuff about the AstroTurf bills, Aaron Reed, who's been a guest on the show, has done a great job tracking all of them as they move through the legislatures. I think all of that is true. But that can be true. And there can be a genuine desire to safeguard against feeding into that. At the same time that I am concerned that the assumption that there cannot exist a good faith desire to understand what truly is the best medical advice for someone who has a child whom they love, who they have no objection to transitioning. Is it possible? Are we basically stipulating that it is impossible for there to be a parent in good faith who actually wants to know more about all of the studies, whatever the realm of science are, and so would have a good faith desire to hear from a scientist from a country, it is Sweden, by the way, who have come up with different protocols for what is medically advised for a kid seeking transition?
Absolutely. If a parent or, a set of adults caring for a given child are interested in what medical route is right for that child, that would also be true if the child needs medical care for something else. Those medical treatments, for example, children with, and I want to be careful with my language here because I'm not the, pathology of trans, like the need for gender affirming and sex affirming medical care. I don't want to say it's because transness is some sort of disease like cancer, but if a parent has a child that is in need of medical treatment, say around diabetes or around cancer care, actually the baseline of what that care looks like is not debated in state houses or on university campuses. It is debated amongst a medical community, and then individuals go and collectives go and find that information and then do compare what different doctors say, what different medical systems say. So actually, this would make such an extraordinary outlier of trans healthcare.
Abortion. But yeah, I take your point.
And that's a problem, right? And the way that's done.
This is different though, right? Like we can all agree, and I certainly would agree with you, that the politicization of these issues is political and agenda driven and in bad faith. However, this started as a conversation of, would it be acceptable? Could it be a good faith and sincere interest in hearing from a medical professional who is outside of the kind of what the American left, let's say, believes about what our doctors think is the best course of care, because there's a genuine interest in the medical underlying medicine. And maybe it's better to move away from this topic because it is so kind of controversial and thorny. I can imagine a world where this is why I'm interested in this. Coleman Hughes is I think he describes himself as politically independent. He's often described as a conservative. He very much doesn't like that. I do think that if you're in a place where everyone's looking at your beliefs and characterizing you as conservative, you have to take a good hard look in the mirror and ask yourself why. But I will respect his choice to self-identify as
I don't think it works that way, but okay.
Okay, fine. But he has gotten a lot of traction, I don't think wrongly so, by pointing out that there have been, mistakes in medicine. For instance, he's really picked up on this way that kidney transplants have been, getting off the kidney transplant list has been racially mediated. And Black patients have been put in a longer line because of the way that Black people were categorized as having different kinds of needs, right? And this kind of racial categorization has actively hurt sick Black people. with the idea being that observing race more is actually going to help Black people. Now, I think this is a relatively narrow and niche circumstance that has happened. But what I do find is sometimes that a conservative will pick up on a legitimately bad piece of science that the left maybe has said, we're going to shut down conversation about this because you need to trust the science. And then when it turns out that the science is wrong, it is this huge validation for the right as to why the whole field must be wrong and that you should never trust scientists again. We see this with COVID, right? That some of the recommendations that were given by the CDC as we learn more about how COVID operated seem to be overly broad, not give the same protections as people thought. There was the flip-flopping on advice about masks, et cetera. And now that has been kind of used to sow broader skepticism, some of which is warranted, I would argue, because science has always been imperfect, and some of which I think is being weaponized to harmful ends. Yes. And so I'm cautious about saying we should shut down any conversation, whether it's about lab leak origin or what medical recommendations around COVID really are, or whether or not some of these racial recommendations around transplants, or even some of the recommendations around trans medical care potentially are kind of off limits, because then aren't you just feeding into this right-leaning campaign that says the left wants to shut down speech to kind of obscure the extent to which they're railroading you into decisions that are actually bad for your family and your livelihood and your welfare?
I think it's a really good question. And I think one thing I think we have to kind of keep stable throughout is that, a white supremacist insisting on the kind of reproduction of certain sort of state nationalisms and how they get reproduced, that kind of right-wing force, those right-wing forces, they will weaponize anything anyway. Right? So we can't suddenly organize our politics, understand how we organize, what we take seriously, what we consider like our needing to assent to in terms of discourse, with the fear that the right will jump on something and try and use it against us. Of course they will. Of course they will. That's always true. And that they will be hypocritical with it. I mean, honestly, I do think there are worse things in the world than hypocrisy. I think,
sure.
Fascism, for example.
For sure.
I'm very much with Judith Sklar on that one. But I do, I do think part of the issue here, and if we're talking about, liberal sign of like, in this house, we believe science. What on earth does that mean? There are like contested sciences, right, as you're saying. And we do have a problem of, an idealization, and it's almost like it's a fault of certain media making too. And siloing is that we there's not enough public understanding of the imperfect arts of science and the practices of science. And there have been and will continue to be paradigm shifts in knowledge production and truth production. And that's how, and I wish there were, I think we should all be working on creating a better understanding of that, such that if we are going to have faith in certain sets of expertise and who gets to stand and be endowed with that expertise, we're not doing it out of some base scientism of, they're the scientists, they know best, such that, the foreclosure of something like lab leaks that now seems at least feasible and plausible makes everything look invalid. And these are, again, I just think these have to be these will always be contested and continuous sites of struggle. I think going off on the assumption that the best way forward is to predict the ways in which the right can weaponize something and make it a kind of reverse slippery slope, then we're always on the back foot. And in the same way saying, talking in sort of abstract of, would I shut down, this, a certain suggestion or a set of suggestions from, a minoritarian medical community, or someone who, a lab that's going against the grain in sort of hypothesis of care. I don't want to talk in generalities or abstractions. I want to talk about actually what's happening in terms of, erasure and eliminationist frameworks around trans existence, which are profoundly reactionary and pro-natalist and conservative and deeply entangled with, taking away healthcare from all of us, taking away bodily autonomy from all of us, and saying like, okay, who is actually inviting which scientists into which places with which agendas? Like, as you were saying, like, science is not neutral. No science has ever been, it's not like going to the moon was neutral. That was part of the space race. But, so looking at the kind of ideological investment in bringing which voices into which places and being attentive to that on a kind of contested and knowing we are in a terrain of ideology and politics and how to deal with that, to me feels like a better approach and a more kind of generous to our ability to learn collectively than to say, just per se, in case of the risk of a fuck up and getting it wrong, whatever it might be, and creating further distrust in the possibility of the help of healthcare and science, we have to just kind of proceed with absolute caution and let everyone talk. Because it's also the case that quite simply not everyone is talking. You don't have a lot of, trans people taking as much, center stage in this so-called debate over their lives as you do, a Swedish doctor. We don't invite Swedish doctors over for other political things very often. So I think we do have to look at like agendas behind things on a case-by-case basis. And I'm nervous to make kind of claims about having an attitude of per se openness to all speech around scientific opinion, just in case, a certain type of trust in a certain overarching expertise or settled expertise at a given moment ends up, in fact, making a mistake and then we go backwards. Because, and again, I certainly don't want to apply that kind of thinking to healthcare around trans youth, which isn't new. Again, it's not new. Trans kids aren't new. And I think, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I just, no, you didn't. I was rambling. But yeah, I think we need to be attentive to kind of who's hosting whomst, where and why, rather than just saying, well, surely these are just scientific opinions up for debate. Like the space is not so pure, and nor could it ever be.
I will say, just as a one-off, that the Milo Yiannopoulos example does seem sort of instructive to me, because there was a lot of pushback against him visiting campus. There were efforts to prevent him from visiting campuses. There were protests during his remarks, which I support, the actual protests. But what ended up felling him was him saying one too many things that did not fit with the conservative movement that had embraced him. What was it? The statements about liking, I don't want to lie. Wait a minute.
And there was also a certain, I think the BuzzFeed, I think it was Joe Bernstein when he was a BuzzFeed, received or got access to a leak of his private emails, and there was certainly things in there that put him at odds with.
It was these pedophilia comments. That's what it was. No one could defend I didn't want to.
You didn't want to say
drawn up on a libel charge here, so I sort of to double check. But yeah, it was the pedophilia
because it's probably
stuff.
all he's doing now, suing people for libel. I have no idea what he's up to these days. But
okay,
no,
so not defaming him. That's what took him down, right? Because nobody could defend pedophilia. So I do sometimes wonder about these platforming arguments. I'm with Nathan Robinson, I think, on this, where if you can platform someone, if you have someone there who's able to offer a contrasting opinion and who's good at it, right? Who's really prepared and is not going to lose the argument, as it were. I think it's frankly more constructive to have the person come and expose them for who they are, if it's done responsibly, than to give them energy. Like Milo Yiannopoulos made a career out of being canceled, right? Until he was ultimately canceled by the group that supported him. But I want to come back to a point that you made that I think was really, really good, and that comes across at the end of your article as you're making this point about the Israeli soldier coming to campus. You make this kind of material analysis where you say, like, this is what the campus stands for, and should the campus be supporting this? And it reminds me of arguments that I made in some early pieces that I wrote for Current Affairs with Nathan Robinson. Shout out. About at the time, what was really front and center in the American consciousness which was this cultural appropriation debate. And I found myself very frustrated as all that was happening, because I felt like I was being compelled by like BuzzFeed or Jezebel or whatever to feel very strongly about Kim Kardashian wearing cornrows, for instance. And there was a lot of backlash that was happening because, more conservative-minded folks were saying, oh, well, are Black people not allowed to play the violin now because white people invented it? And are, Asian people not allowed to speak English because white people invented it? And there were, all these absurd arguments, but they were happening in tandem with absurd arguments on the other side, like, is eating Chinese food cultural appropriation if you're not Chinese? Like, it had all gotten to a kind of absurd point. But I still felt in my soul that there was something core that was legitimate about these concerns about cultural appropriation, even if all of the claims weren't deserving of as much political attention as they were being given. And what I drilled down on is this idea of kind of material exploitation as opposed to the cultural appropriation. Am I mad that Kim Kardashian has cornrows, or am I mad that when Black women wear natural hairstyles, they're told they can't serve in the army or that they're unprofessional at the workplace?
Exactly.
And are we being materially disadvantaged because of how we are being treated differently because of our race? Are we mad that a white person opened a taco shop? Are we mad that white people have more access to the Capitol to open a taco shop than someone who's of Mexican descent? Like, and are we having kind of proxy runs at complaining about inequities that we see, the result of the inequities, instead of like getting to the root of the material inequity that's causing all of these problems? And so when you say, is an institution allowed to stand for something and then not choose to use its dollars to fund something that is antithetical to the purpose of that institution? I kind of like that argument, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. And I found myself thinking back to when I was in college and I was made to feel, quote unquote, unsafe by certain things that happened on campus. If I really drill down, it was that I felt like I was paying money to an institution that said it stood for something that aligned with my political interests, but was behaving in a way that was diametrically opposed to those interests. And it wasn't like I was feeling physically unsafe, but it was that I am being housed, fed, and paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to an institution that seems to not have an interest in standing for the ideals, their own ideals. And that makes me feel vulnerable and exploited.
Yeah, I was going to say exploited is and I think this is also, when you were talking about like the core of things that had justification, I think the way you put it in terms of like why it is such an continued affront that Black women can't wear their hair as they choose or as is natural or chosen in a workplace because it's considered unprofessional. That is just a kind of contemporary iteration of the harms of racial capitalism. And, this is like, with all of these questions, I should probably clarify that I do believe it was the Hillel group, which is extraordinarily well funded, that was paying for anything money related, but obviously it's the New School's campus, they pay the rent there. But no, in terms of like, we can't forget economics in any of this. And that like the reasons we talk about certain disadvantages and certain modes of, harms, inequalities, and violences forged in racial capitalism, forged in 500 years of, colonial racialized order and regimes should inform all of our thinking about this. And, what it's not just which again takes us back to why this isn't just a question of feelings. This isn't just a question of feelings and people feeling othered or people feeling threatened. It's, are we permitting those same violences of global racial empire and capitalist exploitation and excavation to be upheld in our midst just because we are invested in debate. And that also, it does involve the insistence on a gender binary, which is also the historic work of colonialism. So I think, being attentive to the economic question is part of it, certainly, and doesn't get to be part of it long enough. Or deeply enough or consistently enough. And that is one of the key flaws that the left can rightly, argue against and critique, institutional DEI practices in the workplace that are so rarely attentive to, questions of economic exploitation and struggle and poverty. But for me, these have never been a question of, race first, class first debate. It's a question of racial capitalism. And that the two cannot be disentangled. Obviously, it's given that, the way we started this conversation talking about anti-Semitism is a complicated one because the kind of family resemblance concept that is Jewishness does sit in different histories to other, minority groups who have faced historic oppression. It's a different trajectory and it's got different instantiations. And the kind of way the state of Israel functions as a force also functions so differently to, other state forces, other groupings. So, I don't want to pretend these things are analogous. And that's why I do think it has to continue to be case by case struggled, informed by, hopefully all of us taking up and sharing with as many people as we can and each other a really rigorous analysis of racial capitalism and colonial harm.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point and a good one to end on. I mean, we're talking about a billionaire, Bill Ackman, taking up this, this agenda. You have AIPAC having pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars to challenge any of the pro-ceasefire electeds in Congress. And so there is a dynamic here that I think is particularly galling, I think, as a Black, someone who used to be a Black student on Harvard's campus who remembers when the police were called on her Black classmates for using the field. Using the field for like a sporting event outside of the Quad campus. To have that kind of symmetry, as privileged as we, of course, were, the asymmetry of that versus billionaires who are getting in league with the head of Sweet Green and trying to put students by name on a no hire list, and who have the institutional power to really affect the lives long term in a way that these kind of they have to have that kind of power, and then to be exploiting programs or weaponizing programs that were intended to protect people who don't have that economic power to suppress speech of the people who are who are disempowered on college campuses. It is an odd and unsettling kind of a alignment that's happening. And I'm so grateful for you spending way more time than I had suggested we would spend debating these issues, talking it through. You are a very worthy sparring partner, and I've really enjoyed your challenges here today. So thank you again, Natasha.
Oh, thank you so much. No, this was really, really good to talk through and got my brain challenging itself too. So thank you for prompting really excellent questions.
Well, tell me and tell the audience where we can find more of you and your work on the internet and beyond.
So on the internet, most of my kind of responses to political and news events I put at the Intercept.com, where I'm a columnist, and then occasionally book reviews and whatnot at places like Book Forum. And then my next year, if I end up getting myself and my timing together, I'll have another book coming out with Verso Books on the way we, I think, misuse questions of uncertainty. So that is something that if I say it enough in public, I'll actually write the book. So I have to,
I empathize. I empathize with that a great deal. Me too. I'll have a book out next year also.
Yeah, promise. Pinky swear.
All right. Thank you again, Natasha. Thank you all for listening. You know, you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast on Mondays if you subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thank you to all who have already subscribed. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.